Thank you very much, Paul. I think the appropriate scientific response to that video simulation is yikes. That was pretty scary to see. And what we're going to do now, we've seen the consequences of a simulated 100-year flood in East Boston, but disasters are unpredictable. And what we'd like to consider now is what might happen if an even more catastrophic event struck East Boston. The tabletop exercise that we're about to engage in is designed to stretch our imaginations and to think about a worst case scenario for East Boston. The key to these type of disaster scenarios is to consider what is plausible, even though it seems unlikely. The objective of the exercise is not to develop an accurate predictive model for forecasting an extreme storm, but rather to visualize the range of consequences that could occur and to imagine the ways that the community could and should respond to such an event. While we have tried to be faithful to all the scientific climate models, we have also assumed that the worst may still occur. Among the defining features of disasters is how variable the consequences are and how surprising they are to us. Superstorm Sandy, for example, flooded lower Manhattan with a 14-foot storm tide with 9 feet of storm surge. That was much higher than expected and represented a 400-year storm. Poor planning for a disaster often reflects a failure of imagination. As you could see in these images here, disasters often take us by surprise. These are pictures from Hurricane Harvey. These are from Puerto Rico after Maria. These are Superstorm Sandy. And then among the largest storms, Hurricane Katrina, this is the lower Ninth Ward. These are often beyond what we can imagine. So our objectives with this scenario are twofold. One, to consider what the needs of the residents in East Boston will be after a catastrophic extreme weather event. And two, to consider how the community could and should respond. We also want to reinforce that there are two types of response to such disasters. There's going to be a formal response from agencies with federal, state, and local governments, including Boston's first responders, the Office of Emergency Management, the Boston Public Health Commission, and others. But there's also going to be an informal response of neighbors helping neighbors, of community organizations and businesses pivoting swiftly to address the needs of residents, and of voluntary and faith-based organizations rushing in to help. Our scenario is mainly going to focus on the latter, the community response. And although we will try to keep in mind the context of the formal response, we do want you to think about how the community will be likely to respond. A couple of rules before we put you into the breakout rooms. Number one, when you play in this scenario, you should be who you are. So represent who you are in your current role, whether you're a community resident, whether you're a member of a voluntary organization, whether you lead a local community or business, or whether you play multiple roles. Be who you are. Number two, all voices should be respected. So no one voice is more important than another. Number three, don't quibble with the small details. You may take issue with some of the assumptions that we have given you for this scenario that I'm about to describe, but look at the bigger picture. And keep in mind, lastly, that even though there may be local first responders or emergency managers in the breakout room with you, don't rely upon somebody else to tell you what will happen. We really want to know how the community will respond. So here's your situation. It is late October 2030, about a decade from now, when Hurricane Reynaldo makes landfall as a Category 3 hurricane at Chatham, and then a few hours later as a Category 4 hurricane at East Boston. There are sustained winds in excess of 130 miles an hour that are recorded at Logan International Airport. Just like Sandy happened in New York in 2012, Reynaldo took a left-hand turn from the Atlantic Ocean into what many people thought was a protected metropolitan harbor. And like Sandy, Rinaldo hit the area at high tide and full moon. The tides and storm surge combined brought waters rushing into East Boston waterfront at 12 feet above mean sea level. Rinaldo was recorded as the most ferocious storm to hit the area since the Great New England Hurricane of 1938. The water swept through the low-lying streets of East Boston. Blue Line service had been suspended in the hours before landfall, and it remained out of service for a week because of flooding at the Aquarium station. As happened with many businesses in the area, the first floor of the East Boston Neighborhood Health Center in Maverick Square was destroyed. Glass windows broken from windswept debris. The health center's electronic medical record system is offline and inaccessible. The deepest flood line, with waters up to 2 to 4 feet in spots, extended from the East Pier straight up Bremen and Chelsea streets, past the courts, past the Y, all the way up to the public library and Day Square. Some of the deepest flooding was in Liberty Plaza, right by the community's only supermarket. One of the oil tanks near Chelsea Street Bridge was rumored to have leaked, and there is a concern that the standing water from the Chelsea Creek overflow may have been contaminated with oil. Similar concerns have arisen about toxins released at the Charlestown and Jeffreys Point boatyards, which could include waste paint, fiberglass, epoxy resins, etc., into Chelsea Creek and the floodwaters entering Jeffreys Point. There's a concern about contaminated soil in Piers 1 Park, and more generally about toxins released from household debris in the standing floodwaters around East Boston. Despite mandatory evacuation orders, a number of East Boston residents elected to stay in their homes. It's unknown how many people remained in the community. Even if people had stockpiled food and water to last 3 days, this extended disaster will quickly deplete those supplies. So let's get to where we are right now. So you've heard that it struck as a Cat 4 hurricane with these winds. And now what you need to know is that 1 week after the hurricane struck, 1 week after, there is no electricity in approximately 80% of households and businesses. The gas pumps are not working, ATMs are not working, fuel for generators is in very short supply, traffic lights are not working. Some of the natural gas lines have been disrupted. There is no heat and no hot water to approximately 30% of residential buildings, and this includes the Maverick Landing subsidized housing, Heritage Apartments, and Victory Gardens, which are both subsidized and senior housing. Since the storm, which happened in October, daytime temperatures have been dropping to the high 40s and 50s and nighttime in the low 40s. There is a concern about a nighttime frost and the potential to lead to frozen and burst pipes. Stores and markets remain boarded up, destroyed, or closed. There are very few markets selling food. FEMA and the Red Cross have set up distribution points for water and food, but these distribution sites are far from the neighborhoods, either too far to walk or people do not have cars or gas. Transportation is coming back haltingly. The Sumner and Callahan tunnels were flooded. Buses are not operating. Blue Line is not operating. At best, there may be limited ferry service at Lopresti Park to pick up some of the slack. Supply chain and electrical interruptions are affecting many, many aspects of life in the community. Pharmacies and their abilities to stock medicine. Dialysis centers, which are closed. There are a couple of mobile dialysis units going through the neighborhood, but it's unclear when and where they show up. Addiction therapy has been suspended, including methadone maintenance and opioid treatment. Home healthcare providers cannot access their clients. Electrical dependent and oxygen dependent households and homebounds are still believed to be living in the community. Most food pantries and shelters, including domestic abuse shelters, were closed because they could not operate safely. There are 2 large mass care shelters in the community. The 190-bed Don Orione nursing home has an emergency generator, but has limited fuel supply. It can only power critical infrastructure. 3 residents of the nursing home have died since the storm, and the local funeral homes have not been able to remove the bodies yet. The refrigeration unit that holds the bodies is being powered by the generator, but that comes at the expense of most lighting and television throughout the building. There are also staffing shortages at the nursing home, with most of the nursing and support staff having been at the home since before the storm. The National Guard has been activated, and there are many federal agencies circulating throughout the community. Because of the electrical disruptions, there is very limited internet, limited data availability, and some cell towers are not operational. All the schools and daycare centers are closed. It is pretty grim, the picture I've just painted. It looks a lot like parts of New York City looked in the week after Sandy. This is entirely plausible. With that, I'm going to be breaking everybody out into breakout rooms now. And when you go into the room, there will be a facilitator and a note taker. And they've got a series of questions that they're going to ask you. The first breakout room, we're going to take about 20 minutes to work through these questions. We're going to come back after that and talk about it. And then after that, we're going to have a second breakout room with all the same people in the room with you, and then come back and talk about that. So with that, I'm going to ask our video production team to send everybody into their breakout rooms. Good luck.